All right. Can everybody hear me okay? Cool. Sounds great. Well, let me start by just saying thank you for having me. I've been in Ohio for all of, a handful of hours now, but it's been fantastic. Especially want to thank Dan and Chris and Michael for welcoming here. Had a great afternoon just walking around Lancaster, learning so much from them. And it's kind of strange how we all met. I mean, I ran into Chris and Dan in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, randomly doing a book talk, and I'm really glad we did. It's really amazing how that worked out. I also want to thank the folks here at Allen Chapel. I mean, what a venue. Been really blessed to go around the country, giving book talks, been able to speak in a lot of really great venues, but this one I think really is at the top of the list. So I appreciate everybody, let us do the event here. And so what I want to do is leave plenty of time at the end so we can do question and answer if you'd like. But I do want to talk about the book a little bit. And I think the best place maybe to begin is to start just by where the book began for me. And as I've told folks, whenever I do talks like this, there's really a long story and then a short story. The long story simply has to do with the fact that I grew up outside of Athens, Georgia, which is just a little northeast of Atlanta. And once, twice, three, maybe four times if we were lucky, my family would go down to Savannah, to Hilton Head, to Fripp Island, St. Simons, Jekyll. Never been to Cumberland, but I'd like to go. And it just so happens that for all of the first 30 minutes or so of that trip, you are on the path of Sherman's March. I mean, you're going down roads, pathways that the Army would have marched down. And coincidentally, that's actually the route that I take home to go see my parents today. And then when I go see my wife's family, my in-laws, we go the other direction towards Atlanta, and that's another route that Sherman's Army took. And then two, when we got down to the coast, as much as I enjoyed sitting on the beach, playing golf, fishing, doing the things you do at the beach, what I really enjoyed doing when I got my license was just driving around the low country. Going to all the different islands, driving around the coast, all the different waterways, kayaking, boating, whatever we could do. And so when the time came for me to write a book like this, when I was at Yale, very far from home, feeling very homesick, it was only natural, I think, that I would choose some sort of topic that combined places that I love the most, both my home state of Georgia, but also the low country, right, the place that I have such fond memories of. So I'd like to think that the book really kind of started there, just with my own biography and background. But the short answer actually has to do with me reading a work of fiction. Has anybody ever read E.L. Doctorow? People familiar with E.L. Doctorow? Yeah, Doctorow's one of our great fiction writers. He writes historical fiction. I think he's one of the best. He's one of the best we've ever produced. And he's probably most famous for a book called Ragtime, which is a book about America at the turn of the 20th century. It's really well known. It's a great book. But Doctorow also tried his hand at writing about Sherman's March in a book he called simply The March. It's a fictional story, but it's a fantastic story. And as Doctorow had a habit of doing, and if you've read Ragtime, you know this is true, he wrote with a wide cast of characters. In the story, Sherman is a character. There is a German-born U.S. Army surgeon. There's a white Southern debutante who becomes kind of the love interest. It's really strange. It's really weird. There are two Confederate prisoners of war who are kind of the tragically comic characters in the story, right? They have a real tragic but also really funny story. And as I said, even Sherman himself appears as a character in The March. But Doctorow also included as a character in his story a freedwoman by the name of Wilma Jones, who drops everything, runs to Sherman's army, and then follows Sherman's army all the way to Savannah. And you later learn that she is likely the mother, if not the grandmother, of another very famous character in one of Doctorow's books, but I'm not gonna spoil that. Let you read that. But anyway, it struck me, being a lifelong Georgian, a student of history, someone interested in history, that Wilma Jones would not have been a singular character, right? That she would have been a composite character. There were likely many hundreds, if not thousands, of Wilma Joneses, people just like her, who dropped everything, ran to the army, and then followed the army to Savannah. And so the question that really gave rise to this book was, well, can we tell the story of Wilma Jones and people just like her who experienced the Civil War, not as a work of fiction, but as a work of real history, right? Can we actually tell this story as real history? And that, in a sense, is the question that birthed this book, that got me started writing this book, and it's the story that sort of animated the writing process. And in some respects, I've always seen this book as being a kind of a companion piece to the Doctorow novel itself. And so if we fast forward to now, my book tries to do just that. And it is what its subtitle implies. It's a history of Sherman's march through Georgia, told from the perspective of enslaved people. It focuses on the story of emancipation as it emerged at the end of Sherman's army and as it marched through Georgia. And I should say, I'm able to tell this story because when Sherman pulls up to Savannah in December of 1864, he speculates that there are as many as 20,000 refugee enslaved people following his army. That's 20,000 people who dropped everything, ran to the army, followed the army, and then completed the march all the way to Savannah. That's 20,000 Wilma Joneses. And we should recognize that's an extraordinarily large number. Atlanta, right, metro of state of Georgia, only had a population of about 10,000 in 1860. Savannah, which was Georgia's largest city, one of the largest cities in the South, had a population of only 22,000. So this is a movement of people that's the size of a large southern city. If we want to use Sherman's army for comparison, that's a third of his overall force that's marching through Georgia. This is a massive, massive movement of people. And what my book does that's new or novel, right, in the history of Sherman's march, is that it places the refugees and their experiences at the very center of the story of Sherman's march. Now, some of you may not be surprised to know that this is not always how the story of Sherman's march has been told. Instead, for several generations now, historians have wondered or asked the question whether or not Sherman's scorched earth tactics in Georgia represented the birth of what's known as total war, meaning did Sherman's tactics preview what would come later in World War I, World War II, Vietnam, some of these more modern conflicts? And the answer is not really, but kinda. And we can talk about the kind of nuances there, maybe in Q&A if we want to. But certainly if you've seen Gone with the Wind, you know the central sort of image of that film is Atlanta all ablaze. And I can tell you as a native Georgian that there's still plenty of people in Georgia who see Sherman as something of the enemy, right? As the man who was too loose with his matches in Atlanta, so on and so on. And so because of that, right, we've always seen Sherman's march as a military event. We focused on Sherman, his kind of cult of personality, right? We focused on the soldiers. We focused on the experiences of white Georgians. But we've always come back to seeing it first and foremost as a military event. And the reality is that it was a military event, almost by definition, right? But what's lost in this history is that for enslaved people, it was always so much more than that. For enslaved people, Sherman's March was a true liberation event. It was a true freedom movement. And in the book, I use that term freedom movement for a couple different reasons. On the one hand, I use it in a very sort of literal sense, right? This is the campaign that conquered the Confederacy, that destroyed slavery. It's a campaign in which many tens of thousands of enslaved people experienced freedom just as a consequence of that campaign. And it's a campaign in which as many as 20,000 people sought to make freedom meaningful for themselves by following the army come what may, sometimes enduring incredible hardship just to get to where the army's going. And if I could just say one other thing about this 20,000 number, we should recognize that's kind of a lowball number for the amount of people that were truly involved in this experience, right? That doesn't take into account the people who ran to the army and then turned back or were turned back by the army. It doesn't take into account the people who ran to the army but then ultimately decided not to follow along. It doesn't take into account the many hundreds or many thousands of people who, nonetheless experience freedom just by, right, being in Georgia and experiencing this military campaign, right? So that 20,000 number is something of a lowball number. And so if we total all this combined, what we get is very likely America's largest liberation event, largest emancipation event. The real grassroots military experience, right, that did what the Emancipation Proclamation could have only ever done on paper, right, as a document. But I also refer to it as a freedom movement in a maybe more abstract, larger sense, in the sense that this refugee movement behind Sherman's army was so large that it would go on to have a real impact on what Reconstruction would look like. Everything from the nature of the Freedmen's Bureau, which is the government's central agency created to oversee the transition from slavery to freedom, to the future of land reform on the Georgia and South Carolina coastline, to the very meaning of what freedom would look like after the Civil War itself, right? All these things had plot points and storylines that point back to Sherman's March or its aftermath. And so in that sense, I think one of the ways we can think about what Sherman's March was yes, one of the last campaigns of the Civil War, but also maybe the earliest battle of Reconstruction, right? The first episode, the first chapter in Reconstruction. And that, I think, overall is kind of how I would like people to maybe think about Sherman's March. I think that points to the overall argument of the book, which is that, yes, Sherman's March was a Civil War campaign, right? But it was also one of our landmark moments in the making and the shaping of what we think of as American freedom, right? Yes, it's similar to a Shiloh, to a Gettysburg, to Vicksburg, but in a lot of respects, it's also a lot like Philadelphia in 1776, like Selma, Alabama, like Lincoln at Gettysburg, right? Like Yorktown. Some of these seminal moments in American history that we think about when we think about what American freedom actually means. And that is the kind of ultimate argument that I try to make in the book, and the kind of story that I try to tell in the book. But I do want to say a little bit more about what is going on in Georgia. And I want to say a little bit about what's happening on the ground in Georgia. And I'm sure many of you know this, but perhaps the best place to start is just by talking a little bit about what the state of the war was like in November of 1864 when Sherman began marching from Atlanta towards Savannah. And I want to start by talking a little bit about the history of emancipation. By this point in the war, the Emancipation Proclamation has been issued. The U.S. government has embraced emancipation as a war aim. But it's important for us to recognize that what's about to happen in Georgia was not new. From the very start of the Civil War, all the way until the very end, enslaved people consistently did things to try to get to where the army was. As I said, this happens at the very beginning, in May of 1861, and it will only accelerate as the war continues. In fact, historians estimate that maybe as many as 500,000, 600,000 people would attain freedom by fleeing plantations, fleeing parts of the South to the Union Army. And this is one reason why I use the term refugee, because this is a term that many historians have begun to adopt. Because not only does the experience of enslaved people in this moment look like a kind of modern refugee story, in the sense that there was no citizenship rights, there was no rights of asylum, it was an experience of uncertainty, of insecurity, but also one of the things that we don't see on our Civil War landscape, but one of the things that would have been physically present, is that wherever the army was, there were usually large camps, tent cities, refugee camps of enslaved people who had reached the army, made it to the army, and then built these camps right next to the army. It's where they could enjoy freedom, security, or something like it. And in many cases, many of them actually did the work, the labor, that army camps run on, right? So they were essential to the military experience. And so refugees, enslaved people were physically present wherever the Union Army went. Now, just as a little bit more context, as again, some of you probably know, Sherman's March is the campaign that follows the fall of Atlanta. Sherman begins the campaign in November of 1864. In the east in Virginia, Robert E. Lee and his army is pinned down at Petersburg, which is a rail hub just south of Richmond. And for Sherman, taking Atlanta was a big thing, right? Atlanta was the last great industrial sort of hubs of the South. And so what comes next is his decision to march his army, about 60,000 soldiers, from Atlanta to Savannah. It'll cover about 250 miles and take maybe a month and a half, right? So that's what the Savannah campaign looked like. Except this was no ordinary campaign, right? Part of Sherman's calculation was that in moving out of Atlanta, he had to relinquish his supply lines. And so he instructed his men to forage off the farms and fields of Middle and South Georgia, both as a way to sustain themselves, because they didn't have their supply lines, but also as a way of making war on the physical, emotional, and mental wherewithal of white Southerners to keep up the fight, right? So he was very, very intentional about this. And I should say, this is not really surprising coming from Sherman. Going back to the very start of the war, he was always an advocate of a much harsher, less restrained form of warfare. Some of this is just, I think, his own personal nature. Some of this is his own, kind of way he understood the conflict, warfare, etc. But he was also, in some respects, born in 1862 when he was the military governor of Memphis. Because it's in 1862, when he's in Memphis, that he faces the problem of Confederate guerrillas, of the fact that up and down the Mississippi River, there are partisan, non-military Southerners who are firing on civilian ships, who are firing on his own soldiers. So as a way to put an end to this, one of the things he decides to do is to march out to the towns that are harboring these guerrillas and burn them. And sometimes he would leave one single building standing just so where they know where they could mark it on a map, right? It's part of one of the things he did. Later, he began expelling local residents for every shot fired on any of his men, right? So this is the kind of tactics, the kind of approach that he would later put into effect as well in Atlanta, and it previews what he decides he wants to do in Georgia. But Sherman was not indiscriminate in his orders, right? He was not a kind of Genghis Khan character in blue, despite what some folks might believe. In fact, he always wanted his foraging done by the book. He told his men they could take only about 10 days' worth of forage. He said that only officers could requisition livestock, on the assumption that officers, not general soldiers, right, regular soldiers would be more judicious in making this decision. And though one of the signature images of the march is all of these southern homes burning, but what actually was mostly set afire was not homes so much as cotton gins, cotton storehouses, cotton barns. There were some homes that were burned, but usually only if they fired on any of Sherman's men or resisted basically foraging. But it was mostly cotton houses. And in fact, he actually urged real restraint when it came to the poor, because he thought that most poor Georgians had largely given up the fight and could ill afford to lose livestock. But he urged much less restraint in the case of the rich, because he thought that it was the rich who were actually keeping up the fight, and they were the ones who could, very much afford, right, to lose a horse or a pig or a cow. That said, all these instructions went out the window, right? If white Southerners, white Georgians fired on any of his men, he gave his men complete freedom to wreak a commensurate vengeance, basically, if that were to happen. And this is generally the signature image of what the march was. But what's lost in this history, again, is that from the moment the army shoved out of Atlanta, enslaved people began running to meet the army. They did it in the campaign's opening days, and they would do it all the way into the very end. Sherman knew this would happen. He anticipated it. He included in his official campaign orders a kind of refugee instruction or instructions for what his men should do for the refugees, but it would become woefully inadequate for the kind of phenomenon that would happen in Georgia. Enslaved people could look up at the sky and see clouds of smoke on the horizon and know that the army was near. And pretty soon they began arriving in army lines in incredible numbers. Soldiers describe whole families, whole communities, groups of hundreds or more coming to meet the army. And in some small towns, there were so many soldiers, horses, flags, bands, and enslaved people lining up on the roadsides that it all felt like one big wartime emancipatory parade. Out on Georgia's plantations, though, things were much, 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 much more complicated. Because it's here, right, on the farms, in the fields of middle and central Georgia, that enslaved people became sort of third-party brokers, agents in this ongoing conflict between the army and white Georgians. And in fact, one of the consistent features of the march itself, and one of the things that the soldiers will say over and over and over again, is that enslaved people proved to be their lasting allies all throughout the march. Enslaved people served as intelligence scouts. They pointed the way down hidden paths in the woods. They pointed the way to shortcuts. Sherman himself would ask for enslaved people to know a lay of the land. They asked enslaved people to know which plantation might be occupied, which one might be abandoned. And over and over and over again, they provided this information. The best story, one of the best stories, also has to do with what enslaved people would do when the army arrived. Throughout the Civil War, whenever the Union Army came to a plantation community, oftentimes the locals would bury all of their things or try to hide all their things. But of course, they didn't do the hiding themselves. They forced enslaved people to do it for them. And so what this meant is when Sherman's army or soldiers arrived, enslaved people knew exactly where everything had been hidden and were more than happy to point to the corral of horses that are hidden in the woods or to the place in the family cemetery where all the valuables had been buried, right? And they used this information in some cases to actually bargain with the soldiers, to say, I'll show you these things if you let me come along, right? Another great example of just how central enslaved people were to the campaign itself has to do with what happens when the army gets close to Savannah. Near Savannah, the plantations there were far less abundant, in large part because they were rice plantations. And two, by then, folks knew where Sherman's army was going, and they began to pick the places clean. And so there was a period of a handful of days there where some of the foraging parties weren't sure if they were going to come back with their arms full. And not only that, but this is a part of Georgia where there are many rivers to cross. The pace of the march slowed quite a bit. And so there were real worries that maybe the march would stall out in front of Savannah, maybe they would go hungry, and maybe this campaign might actually fail. But the soldiers end up eating quite well because enslaved people taught them how to eat rice. Sherman's army was mostly an army of Ohioans, Indianans, I guess that's how you say that, Illinoisans, folks from Wisconsin don't even try to say that. They didn't know how to prepare rice. If they've eaten it before, they certainly didn't know how to, use a mortar and pestle and husk it, hull it, and cook it. But they didn't have to because the Georgia's enslaved people did it for them and sustained them. In this critical period of time before Savannah, they ate very well because enslaved people provided it for them. And if I can leave you with one sort of lasting image about just how important enslaved people were to the success of the army overall, it has to do with the military pioneers. This is a term that in most circumstances just simply refers to military laborers, right? People who do all sorts of common labor for the army. Dig latrines, bury the dead, so on and so forth. But in the March to the Sea, military pioneers had a very specific job. They were the ones that were to go out in front of the army and actually prepare the roads. But in Georgia, Sherman specifically enlisted and employed refugee enslaved people who came to the army as pioneers, which leaves us with the image of the fact that everywhere the army went in Georgia, on its 4 different columns, there were always scores of enslaved people who were quite literally paving the way for the army's approach to Savannah, right? Which is a much different image that we have of the march itself. Now, I need to talk about what is unquestionably the darkest, bleakest moment in this story. And that's the terrible incident that takes place at a place called Ebenezer Creek. And I want to caution to say that just because it's called Ebenezer Creek, this is much more than a creek, this body of water. I live in Savannah, grown up in Georgia my entire life, very familiar with these bodies of water. These are essentially lagoons, bayous, right? Reaches, necks of the Savannah River, these sort of intercoastal waterways. So it's much more than a creek. And especially in December of 1864, this time of year, the water level would have been higher. And the crossing itself, the creek itself, well, where they would have crossed the creek, is very close to the Savannah River, meaning the current would have been high, right? And just for reference, Ebenezer Creek's about right here. And the incident happens in large part because of one man, Jeff C. Davis. This is, should caution, Jefferson Columbus Davis, not Jefferson Finis Davis, the Confederate president, right? These are two totally different people. Jeff C. Davis was the head of Sherman's farthest left wing. When Sherman marched out of Atlanta, he split his army up into two wings with two columns each, so there were effectively four different lines marching through Georgia. And it's Davis who has the farthest left wing. And this matters because it's going to be his line that crosses the swampiest terrain, right? The most amount of rivers, so on and so forth. And now I should say Davis had a reputation for being a villain. Earlier in the war, he actually murdered a fellow Union general in cold blood. It was a matter of personal offense. Davis walked right up to his offices, killed him point blank, never tried to flee. But he was never tried and never punished because the army needed good soldiers. And so by the time Sherman's march begins, Davis is here commanding, as I said, the farthest left wing, Sherman's 14th Army Corps. And Davis, of all of Sherman's subordinates, was the only one that I can find who actually wrote that he did not like the fact that so many refugees were following him. He complained about this to Sherman. He didn't like this. And he asked for basically instructions about how to stop it. To my knowledge, I haven't found any response from Sherman, anything like that. But what we do know is that Davis basically devises a method of stopping the refugees from following his army. And that method is to basically pull up temporary bridges that are set down for the army to cross creeks and waterways. So he lets the army cross. Before the refugees can cross, he pulls up the temporary bridges, basically leaving them on the other side. And we know that he did this at least once, twice, maybe three times before disaster strikes at Ebenezer Creek. And it strikes at Ebenezer Creek because everyone knew the Confederate cavalry was somewhere around the army, following somewhat closely behind. It just so happens that Ebenezer Creek, as soon as the bridges go up, Confederate cavalry bury into the refugees who are left stranded on the bank. They force many into the water. Many other run up and down the riverbed trying to take whatever cover they could find. Many who went into the water didn't make it out. They were swept away by the current, or they were shot by cavalry shooting into the water. And those who were left stranded on the bank were either killed on sight or captured and re-enslaved. And so we don't know how many might have perished at Ebenezer Creek, but we know that what happened there was truly tragic and horrifying, and unquestionably the bleakest, darkest moment in this entire story. We also know that it represented a real turning point. For many of Sherman's soldiers, this was just evidence for them that what this war was about was freedom, right? For them, seeing enslaved people experience this only sort of burnished, right, a sense of, anti-slavery spirit within the army. Many of them said that this was a sort of turning point for them when they became awakened to, right, exactly what this war would mean and the plight of enslaved people. And then for enslaved people, this is a real turning point because for them, they could now turn back, right? Because turning back meant recrossing the river, marching right back into Confederate cavalry. It's also a turning point because eventually word gets out. Eventually, News of Ebenezer Creek gets back. It's unclear how, but pretty soon Washington, D.C. knows about it. And so when Sherman arrives in Savannah, he's soon joined by Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, who's there ostensibly to requisition cotton, but he's also there to figure out exactly what happened at Ebenezer Creek. And this is why Stanton will ask Sherman to call a meeting in Savannah with 20 of Savannah's black religious leaders. The meeting takes place at what's known as the Green Mansion, now the Green Meldrum House in Savannah. It's Sherman's headquarters. And what unfolds is one of the most amazing episodes in the entire Civil War. In this room, you have Stanton, Sherman, two of the most powerful men in the country, sitting across from a table of 20 of Savannah's leading ministers, who's appointed a single spokesman, a man named Garrison Frazier, to speak on their behalf. Frazier is someone who had purchased his own freedom as well as his wife's freedom 10 years earlier. And several of the people in the room with him had been enslaved right up to the point that Sherman's army arrived in Georgia. And Stanton's the one that does all the questioning, and he is a nationally known lawyer, and he begins to essentially depose Frazier, kind of feel him out, see what he knows. He asks him all these questions about, well, how do you define slavery? How do you define freedom? And Frazier responds just impeccably, right? He offers some of the most succinct definitions of slavery and freedom you could, come up with. But more than anything, Stanton begins asking Frazier what he expects of freedom. The whole idea of the meeting is to understand what to do with the Georgia freedmen, what to do with the refugees. And Frazier's answer is really a vision of freedom that's predicated on land ownership and independence, right? It's part of what Frazier offers. And it's for this reason that only a few days later, Sherman will issue what's known as this famous Special Field Orders number 15, which sets aside requisition plantation space, land, properties from Charleston in the north to Jacksonville in the south for exclusively African-American homesteading along the southern coastline. To date, this would have been the most radical transformation or expansion of what a post-war America could look like. It would have been the most drastic escalation of Reconstruction policy, right? But I want to just point out this really amazing nugget that we have about how this meeting transpired. Because at one point, Stanton basically asked Frazier, so how have you come by your opinions? What gives you the ability to speak on behalf of others, right? Like, what authority do you have to sort of speak for everyone? And he says, well, I've come by my opinions in the course of my ministry, but also in the talks with the many hundreds of people who came with Sherman's army to the city, whose numbers, he says, surpassed even his own expectation. Which is an amazing sort of nugget that when you do this sort of thing, you find in the archive and you just think, wow. Because what it suggests is that despite not having a physical presence in that room that evening, the refugees nonetheless found a way to have their political visions heard, their voices heard. They found a way to affect history, large-scale history, policy questions about Reconstruction, the shape of what freedom might mean after the Civil War, simply by moving in numbers, by having the courage and the fortitude to follow the army, by pressing the army, by voting with their feet, so to speak, right? And so these are people that have been sort of lost to history, they're somewhat faceless to history, but nonetheless, through their own collective action, they found a way to have an enormous impact on the Civil War, particularly the early years of Reconstruction. Now, if I could just say one other thing, it has to do about what happened to the refugees. And the reality is that as Sherman is approaching Savannah, he is already asking himself this question of what to do with the 20,000 refugees that are following his army. Somewhere in middle Georgia, he makes the decision that he is going to begin sending the refugees as soon as he arrives on the coast up to Sea Islands of South Carolina around Port Royal. And you can see that on my handy-dandy homemade map here, right? Sherman's right wing lands at the Ogeechee River, which is maybe 10 miles south of Savannah. And this really becomes the main waterway to the Atlantic for Sherman's army. He builds a kind of outpost there, in part because the Savannah River had been blocked. It was inaccessible, but the Ogeechee was accessible. And so this becomes really the main thoroughfare for the army. And so his plan is to begin transporting the refugees down the Ogeechee, up the coast, around Daufuskie, around Hilton Head, into Port Royal Sound, and to this sort of complex of islands around Port Royal. So why does he do this? Well, because Port Royal has a really interesting Civil War history. Interestingly enough, Port Royal Sound, which is not far from Parris Island for folks familiar with the Marine Corps, it's the deepest deep water port on the southern coastline. So this really matters going back to 1861 in the early days of the war, because the U.S. Navy believed that if they could take Port Royal Sound, the port of Port Royal and the town of Beaufort, they could use that as an outpost to begin blockading both Savannah and Charleston. Right? It's basically equidistance between the two cities. And they do. They do this in the fall of 1861, so going back to the very beginning of the war. Well, when federal naval gunships pull into Port Royal Sound, it forces all the local residents there to flee. This is some of the wealthiest slaveholders in the South. They all evacuate, and they leave behind roughly 10,000 enslaved people, who, in a de facto sense, are free. But this is still 1861. This is not how the U.S. government defined them just yet, right? It'd take quite a bit of time to get to the Emancipation Proclamation. And what happens is that Salmon Chase, Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury, former governor of Ohio, is a real abolitionist. He views Port Royal as a real opportunity. And what he envisions is essentially turning Port Royal into a freedmen's colony, whereby teams of northern missionaries, agents, school teachers, pastors, ministers, philanthropists would come down to the islands. They would build schools, build churches, provide humanitarian aid. And then critically, and this is the critical part of this plan, they would also convince, coerce, enslaved people to return to cotton plantations, not as enslaved laborers, but as free laborers. So this entire vision, this entire project was known as the Port Royal Experiment, and it was imagined as being the sort of opening chapter in this transition from slavery to freedom. And again, this is all happening in 1861, right? So we're still a couple years, right, until the Emancipation Proclamation. So it's meant to be a kind of opening moment, right, in the government's overall evolution to embracing emancipation. And it becomes that. Port Royal has a very complicated history. I won't go into it. I talk a little bit about it in the book. But it matters for us because by 1864, as Sherman's approaching Savannah, he thinks that Port Royal is the best place for the refugees. He thinks that there's infrastructure there to support them. There's already humanitarian aid. It's also in his own self-interest because he's about to march through South Carolina, and he does not want 20,000 refugees following his army. He wants them to go to the islands where they begin pursuing land, and they have an infrastructure of support for them. But this becomes a critical mistake. Because while, yes, there was an infrastructure of support on the islands, there was not enough there to accommodate 20,000 plus people at this point. This doubles the amount of people that are already there. There's a lack of space. Initially, there's not a lack of food, but eventually there are food shortages. And then two, eventually, disease spreads wildly. And many of the refugees begin dying of disease, and many of them from simple exposure, being exposed to the elements for too long. Many of them had marched for many weeks, many days at the end of an army, and here they are being essentially transported again up to the coast, their refugee experience is continuing. And there's even evidence that some of the refugees who arrive on the islands come from as far away as Chattanooga, right? Which is a long journey indeed. And so what happens is that Port Royal becomes really the epicenter of a pretty sprawling refugee crisis that spans the southern coastline. And this is where the story begins to take a dark and tragic turn. And it takes another dark and tragic turn after Lincoln's assassination, because by the summer of 1865, Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor, will begin rolling back those plans to redistribute land on the southern coastline. He begins doing this in large numbers, of course, the summer and the fall of 1865. And one of the reasons he's allowed to do this is because this sort of coincidence of history, which is that Congress had gone out of session. Congress went out of session in March of 1865 and didn't reconvene until December of 1865. Just think about that. In this critical period of American history, the legislative calendar, right, sort of got in the way and allowed someone like Johnson to have really the full run of the U.S. government. And so this is where the story of the refugees come to a close. Because by the late summer of 1865, the winter of 1866, or 65, 66, the spring of 1866, many of the Georgia refugees who now have been settled on the Sea Islands, their refugee experience is continuing, they've lost access to land, many of them simply march home. They march back to Georgia. And so what this means for us is that the story of Sherman's March is one that ends in a moment of ambiguity, right? Yes, it was one of these defining moments of American freedom. It was a moment that influenced what Reconstruction would look like, but it's also a moment that is unfulfilled, right? And so in that sense, the refugee story of Sherman's March is in some ways indicative of our entire Civil War, in that it is a story that remains unfulfilled. So with that, thank you. I'm happy to take questions. Yeah, sure. Well, to the first question, he, to my knowledge, he faces no punishment. There's no consequence. And in fact, he goes on to have a long military career. He goes and he fights the Modocs in Northern California, Southern Oregon. He later gets involved putting down union organizers in 1877. So he has a long military career, and to my knowledge, he never loses rank. I could be wrong on that, but he faces no serious repercussions for it. And I should say, Sherman stood by him. He stood by him. He stood by his man the whole time. He didn't, he never backed off of that. At the same time, everyone who was present knew that what he did was a pretty dastardly thing. They knew that Confederate cavalry was hovering around. They knew that he did not want the refugees there. They knew that he was what they called a kind of copperhead, meaning that he was from southern Indiana. He was a kind of a Democrat who supported slavery, kind of. I mean, that was his politics. They knew this about him. He had a reputation. And in fact, many of his own soldiers will essentially curse him afterwards. Some of them say they write to their congressman. One says that he should actually watch his back because his own men might shoot him. So it's pretty clear that amongst the people who were there, that what he did was, horrific, right? And that there was no justification. And in fact, some people will point to the right wing, others that are on the other side of Sherman's column, say, well, they crossed as many rivers as Jeff Davis did. There was no need for them. They didn't see the need to pull up the bridges, right? So why only Jeff Davis, right? So to answer the question, to my knowledge, he faced no repercussions, and Sherman stood by him. Some of his fellow generals did, but the rank and file, didn't, for the most part. Yeah.
I have a question on your research. While researching, was there anything that surprised you or changed your opinion of Sherman?
Of Sherman himself? That's a great question. It's a great question. You know, it's hard to say because this book, Sherman is clearly a character. He's an important character. But I really tried to not sideline Sherman, but at least try to elevate the voices of the enslaved people themselves, right? So Sherman appears in the book, but I really tried to make the book, mainly about them, solely, right? So Sherman's voice appears. He is a character. He's present throughout the book. But in some ways, I tried to sort of, minimize his voice. But the thing about Sherman, and we were talking about this earlier, that's so interesting to sort of think about is he had so much influence on policy and on politics and on strategy. And I've shared this with Dan and Chris, but I'm working on a biography of Sherman now, so I'm kind of living in this world more than I think I want to be. But he was someone that also did not want to think that way, if that makes any sense. He didn't want to talk about politics or policy, right? It's almost as if these big sort of critical questions of the war, sort of social issues, what did the war mean? It's like he didn't think about it. It's like he didn't want to think about it. He was a soldier, and that was how he defined himself, and that was it. And, it's hard when you write about someone like this because, my advisor, he wrote a biography of Frederick Douglass, and he always said it was very hard to get at the real Douglass because you never knew if he was writing something for public consumption, so therefore he was, putting an image of himself. People that write about Lincoln say the same thing, like how do you differentiate Lincoln the man from Lincoln the politician? Sherman has the exact opposite problem. He tells you exactly what he's thinking all the time. And so if you're writing, what you want him to do is actually grapple with some of these questions. Be nuanced, right? See the gray in things. But he never did. He was black and white. He was blunt. He was terse. He just sort of, he wouldn't grapple with these questions.
What about at the beginning of the war? He was for slavery.
Mm-hmm. Very much so.
And now this march, did he change? How did he change?
It's a great question. You're absolutely right. Sherman was someone who had no issues with slavery. And in fact, this may be controversial to say, because I'm here in Ohio, here in his birthplace, but he always was kind of something of a Southerner. He identified with the South because he spent so much time in Charleston. He lived in St. Louis, Missouri was a slave state. He lived in New Orleans for a while. And he was teaching at what is now LSU before the Civil War. And when he's in Alexandria, Louisiana, before the Civil War, he writes to his brother basically saying that, or he writes to his wife basically saying that his views on slavery are good enough for this country meaning the South. He had plenty of Southern friends. It was never lost on him when he was fighting in places like Vicksburg that many of the people that were behind those siege lines were his old friends and his old buddies, some of the students that he had taught in the South. And so when the war begins, he does not see slavery as having anything to do with it. For him, it's a matter of national integrity, and that's it. And in fact, as emancipation begins to unfold in Congress, he writes letters to his brother John, who is a senator, basically saying that this is a mistake, that you're trying to get us to do something that on the ground is not feasibly possible, right? And he resists this evolution for as long as he can. That being said, by 1864, he has evolved, if only ever so slightly. And what I mean by that is he now believes that slavery, attacking slavery, is a way to end the war, that targeting slavery is a way to hasten the end of the war. He thinks it's a worthwhile war aim. He also begins to know, and he doesn't always back this up, but he begins to know that styling himself as a liberator is good for him politically, that it's a good image. And, his army did probably likely, help liberate more people than any other army in the Civil War. So this is something that he embraces in of himself. But Sherman's problem in Georgia is that he does not recognize that the refugees might run to his army in the size and scale that they will. He issues this refugee policy, and what his policy basically says is that refugees can come along if they're willing to work, if they can sort of take care of themselves, right? But it should be the soldiers to see to their own supply, right? This is a serious question. But what Sherman doesn't realize is that the refugees are going to run to his army regardless of what he says, right? He thinks that only he or his army will determine what emancipation will look like. And what he doesn't realize is that refugees are going to make their own calculations and run to the army. and have a say-so in what this march might look like.
What kind of makeup were the refugees? You talked about the woman.
Uh-huh.
So what about men, women, and children?
Yeah, that's a great question. The fact is, most of the refugees would have likely been, maybe the way to say this is overrepresented by women and children. And here's why. Because many of the men who were of working age would have likely found a position within the army serving as a laborer. And so this would have forced women, children, and the elderly basically to the end of the army. And so when we talk about who the refugees were, the majority of them were likely women, children, and the elderly. And there are harrowing stories, and some of them are included in the book, women fleeing to the army with 20, 30, 40 children at a time, and basically taking care of these children at the rear of the army for weeks. Yeah. Oh. Good. It's very nice of you. That's right.
And so, a lot of us said, things came to a halt with that. But when you talk about the freedmen and what they went through to, march in thousands to get to freedom, and that's the story, are you constantly amazed at how history keeps repeating itself?
Yeah. Absolutely, because I think history matters, right? I mean, that's what I try to tell my students, and so to see it repeating itself, or at least rhyming, right? It's only, I think, a plea for the fact that history matters, So I'm not surprised, but it definitely makes, I think it only underscores just how important it is, So.
So I think of the Underground Railroad and slaves, people going north
Uh-huh.
to get away from, because here in Georgia there's
Sure.
the heart of the Confederacy.
Uh-huh.
So were they thinking that they were going to be protected by Sherman's army because they're going towards where they were,
Yeah, that's a great question. What they were trying to achieve was some kind of freedom. And this is partly why the book's titled the way it is, and part of the thing that comes out of the book which is that freedom in this moment, whatever it was completely ill-defined. It was undefined. What it meant, right, to run to the army, what could be expected there was undetermined. And in some cases, freed people found something like freedom. In some cases, they did not, right? But part of the story, right, of the Civil War, right, and a part of the story of the march is that they were doing it anyway and attempted to define freedom for themselves by simply running. And part of the calculation is that, well, the army is the sort of monopoly of force in the area. They are the power in the area. The army is a representation of the U.S. government, so therefore it has to mirror what is government policy, which at this point in time, right, the government has fully embraced emancipation. And so this is one reason why Georgia becomes such a big phenomenon, because at this point in the war, it's very clear, right, that fighting slavery, that emancipation is a central part of it. And so this becomes a sort of incitement and invitation for enslaved people to only run to the army even more. But at a baseline level, part of what they're trying to do is get to some sort of sense of security. So that's why they're willing to follow the army wherever, is because the army was able to provide that security. But there are also amazing stories about how enslaved people also knew that this was a movement that was bringing people together. And so many people left to go try to find family, and things like that.
Yeah, you said most of the refugees went to Port Royal,
Uh-huh.
and eventually that kind of collapsed because of Johnson coming in.
Uh-huh.
And they started going south. Did they go back to the plantations they were on, or where did they go?
They went wherever they could. In some cases, yes, because there was very few options, left. But in some cases, they went wherever they could go. But what happens is in Georgia is the fact that as the land is taken away, those that have solid claims to it, many of them are not the refugees. It's the people who had been on the South Carolina Sea Islands beforehand, right? So because of that, they have weak claims to begin with. So that leaves them with no option than to go to find something better. And we don't really know exactly where they went afterwards. It's hard to find that in the archive, right? But presumably some of them did, but also they went wherever they could reconstitute family, recreate community, that sort of thing. But again, that's a really hard question to actually kind of pinpoint, right?
You think if they're going to head back down, why would they not go north? Would it be more acceptable than going back south where the southern plantation owners were still trying to enslave them in different ways?
Well, many of them did. There is evidence of a migration to the north. There's also evidence of migration to the cities. So a place like Savannah becomes a kind of haven, right? Many of them would try to go to where the Freedmen's Bureau would be, right? So there is some evidence there is, internal migrations, right, showing that people were trying to go to places where they could continue, right, to have the sense of security that they achieved or did not achieve, right, with the Army. Yeah.
I know that there were black regiments that were formed in the Union Army during the war.
Uh-huh.
Is there any record of any of those regiments joining Sherman's Army during the Georgia and Carolinas campaign? Being formed during that,
I don't know of a single regiment that joined Sherman's army. There were many that were formed in Savannah, but Sherman was actually someone who resisted the USCT. There were attempts to have USCT regiments in his army, and he resisted that. And to my knowledge, he kind of won. And that there were no USCT regiments in his army. And even Lincoln gets involved. Lincoln writes him and says, "I'm asking you to, sort of accommodate yourself here, follow the law." And he basically says, "We'll talk about this after Atlanta." That's what he says. And even in Savannah, he is really critical of efforts to get him to embrace the USCT. And he would point to a variety of different reasons for that, but fundamentally, he didn't want the USCT in his army.
One of the things you bring up is that in the most hopeful days of the emancipation, there really was a spiritual view of the new day coming, of the kingdom coming as the people were motivated to join along in the march. They were hoping for something that God was in the midst of, and perhaps Moses was their leader.
That's a good point. I mean, one of the metaphors that's often used in the Civil War by, enslaved people and otherwise, because the 19th century South was an extraordinarily religious place. It's extraordinarily religious. But one of the metaphors that's used is the term Jubilee, right? This is something I write about a little bit in the book. This is a metaphor that's all over Sherman's March. Enslaved people invoke it, the soldiers invoke it. And this goes back to Leviticus, and it's a moment of social regeneration and renewal. It's a moment where enslaved people are freed, debts are absolved, lands are broken up, so on and so forth. And for enslaved people and for soldiers, this is what they're seeing. And this is the metaphor, this is the language they reach for to try to describe it. And in fact, in the famous song, the Henry Walkfoot song, Marching Through Georgia, it's, hurrah, hurrah, we bring the Jubilee, right? So religion is absolutely a part of how people were interpreting what was going on around them. Yeah. And you had a hand up?
Oh, just to kind of go back to what the gentleman had said, just kind of piggybacking on what he said in the question that he asked. So, if the Port Royal 1864 experiment wasn't necessarily successful, in your research, have you found more maybe diffused elements of settlements like at Mitchellville and Hilton Head and Penn Center, like in St. Helena?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, all those places are there, and that becomes a model for what's going to happen across the South. And to your point, I mean, is Port Royal a success or a failure? Depends on how, what we'd classify as a success or a failure, They built scores of schools in Port Royal. It certainly helped force the government to embrace emancipation at a wider level, but at the same time, there are all sorts of problems. Labor was an issue. Enslaved people didn't want to go back to... from my understanding, work wasn't the issue, it was working cotton. They wanted to work in sweet potatoes, corn, things like that provide sustenance, not some market commodity like cotton. Land was another big issue. So there was always real challenges at Port Royal. And was it a success? Was it a failure? It depends on it depends on if you're a glass half full, glass half empty kind of person.
Because I don't know much about Port Royal, but I was just saying, I feel like with that many people
Uh-huh.
conversation, close to 30,000. And then we see kind of, the
Oh,
leaving.
oh, yeah,
So smaller, more maybe like, I don't know, like rural isolated.
Sure, yeah, no, I see what you're saying, yeah. Well, that's one of the things that happens is the people that are on the islands, the agents and whatnot, they know that they're facing a problem. And so one of the things that they begin trying to do is to expand Port Royal. And so they begin trying to settle Edisto Island, Morgan Island, Defusky, Hilton Head gets settled. Mitchellville's already there, I think, but Hilton Head becomes settled. So they try to begin expanding it. But the problem with this is that, like, and I can say this because I've seen some of these places, right? Some of these places still aren't that well settled, Defusky, Hilton Head, right? There's a lot of beach homes, but places like Morgan Island, places like, well, Edisto's settled, but it's a long way from Beaufort, right? I mean, it's a wide river. And a lot of these places on the map, right, it looks like land, but it's really marsh, right? And so it's a really sort of tough thing to do. But they do try to expand outward, and especially after Field Order 15 they do, but it's a hard thing to do, just given the landscape, given the nature of things, and also the dwindling lack of resources, because when the Army leaves, there's less and less resources for them to use.
It's not so much of a question, but as a comment. I appreciate what you were saying about the enslaved people, so many following,
Mm-hmm.
because it makes my story, it makes more sense. There were 3 young boys, they were teenagers, that followed Sherman, and they became his and another general boot boy.
Mm.
But the one in particular that Sherman took a liking to was of my family lineage.
Oh, wow.
And he stayed with Sherman, kept him throughout the war. After the war, he brought him to Lancaster
Is that right?
and set him up at an education. And as he got older, apprenticeship,
Uh-huh.
set up a job. And then his parents somehow found him. After the war, they were looking for him. Somehow, I know it was God,
Uh-huh.
found him in Lancaster.
Wow, how about
By
that?
this time, Sherman himself went to New York. So he left John kind of the guardianship
Mm-hmm.
over the Hooper family.
Wow, how about that?
So that's part of my family.
That's amazing. It's an amazing story.
So I had no idea that many
Mhm.
enslaved people were following
Yeah.
Sherman, so that makes more sense.
Yeah.
It's
Well-
really cool that it's because of him that our family
Yeah.
is in Lancaster.
Well, I'm glad you shared that. I'm glad you're here tonight. Yeah, no. And, I think it is important. I mean, one of the things that someone that I really, respect and admire said is that history is best when it's like a Thanksgiving table, meaning the more chairs you have, the more leaves that are put on the table, the more places that are set, the more voices you have, right? The more robust, the more interesting, the more, lively, the more true kind of conversation you can have. So that's been part of the effort. So thank you. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Mine is a little bit of a comment. There's probably a question in there too, but as the last woman mentioned, Sherman moved to New York
Uh-huh.
in the late part of his life, but before then, his burial was in St. Louis.
That's right.
Both New York and St. Louis are very heavily African-American settled today, and I'm sure
Uh-huh.
were in the Reconstruction time, beginning to boom in their African-American settlements. Sherman, did he have visitors to his homes in New York and in St. Louis that were formerly enslaved, thanking him for the march happening and for the freedom that he was the Moses for, almost?
Not that I can tell. I've never seen any sort of evidence for that. I mean, presumably it could have happened, but I haven't seen anything to suggest that did happen. So maybe, who knows? But when he was by the time he went to New York, he was mostly going to the theater. That was his end of life pastime, and he's only there for a few years before he dies. Yeah.
I'm exposing my weak history, but so everyone keeps talking about Moses, and that applied to Sherman, but they also use that term with Harriet Tubman.
Sure.
And then she was there at the Combahee River race.
That's right.
Is that when? That's way before. That's like 1861 when you said they were getting. When did that happen? And how did the pieces fit?
The
Sorry.
Combahee River Raid is in 1863.
1860, so it's not that long before.
It's not that long before. And it's close. The Combahee River is, let's see, it is, if my geography is correct, and again, there's a lot of rivers down there, it is one of the riverways that are up here that sort of branches northward from there. Which looks close on the map, and it is, but it's also kind of a long way away because of the water.
I guess I was wondering, like, you had said that they used that as a strategic point to kind of keep the blockade for
Mhm.
Savannah and for Atlanta. What were they doing with that raid? Like, at that
With the Combahee River?
Yeah, well, how did that fit into the?
Well, I mean, what you have to recognize about Port Royal, this whole area, is that it's really just this island community here.
Okay,
Everything off of that was still
in the thick of it.
in the thick of it, right? And so part of the raid was to target, enslaved people, right, to try to help them escape, but also to target Confederate forces in the area, which would have been all around. And again, this area can be kind of confusing because, like, this really is a kind of isolated island community because it's so hard to get elsewhere because of the marsh and because of water, right? And so literally, right, just across the river in some of these places, I mean, it's not part of Port Royal, right? They were always kind of fearful of that. And in fact, Edisto is essentially, at least 5,000 refugees come to Port Royal from Edisto during the middle of the war because Edisto's attacked by the Confederacy. It's essentially retaken. The U.S. Army tries to take it. They do take it. It's taken back, kind of changes hands. And so, I mean, even Edisto, right? It's so close, right? Well, again, close.
Like I said, I was trying to put this together.
Sure.
I had another question, like, kind of a preview. You said you're talking about a biography of
Uh-huh.
Sherman. How do you feel his Civil War career and, the march later, how is that reflected? And he did a lot out west.
Sure.
with the Indians. So how is that role, like, the same or different, like mirrored or?
It's hugely important. It's hugely important because part of what he's trying to do here is target the material base that white Southerners could use to continue fighting the war. And part of the innovation that he and Phil Sheridan developed in making war against Native peoples is partly to make war on their, material ability to live. Kill the buffalo, but also one of the innovations they developed is essentially making warfare in wintertime. When Native people, when their horses are weak, there's no fresh grasses for them to survive on. And so a lot of the kind of tactics of the march of the Civil War doesn't happen immediately, but it's later reborn in the West.
Do you like Sherman?
Do I like Sherman? I don't know. No, I mean, there's times where, he's certainly interesting. I'll say that. Do I like him or not? I don't know. To be determined. Some days I do. When you do a biography like this that you've been with him for as long as I have, there's some days yes, and some days not really. So it really depends on which Sherman and which day and what's he doing. But he is an interesting guy. He was certainly quotable. He had a lot of anxiety about things, despite his, under his image, reputation, I guess we could call it. He's consistently worried about money. He had a lot of complex family things going on. So it's always interesting, I'll say that.
Some of us are grateful for Sherman.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, no, I'm sure. Yeah.
I'm from the South.
Oh, okay.
You talk about Sherman, and what I like about him is Sherman, he saved Lincoln.
Uh-huh.
By taking Atlanta.
Yeah.
He saved Grant, because Grant was the lead, he was with.
Yeah.
And, sure, he was a general and stuff, and he had to do some things that he probably regretted.
Uh-huh.
But, like he said, war is hell.
Uh-huh.
And you gotta make it, as badly as possible. Again, people just hang around and keep on going.
Yeah. Yeah, one thing you have to give Sherman credit for was that, like Grant, he knew how to get things done. And part of the trouble of the U.S. Army in the early days of the war was that they had so many political generals, they didn't really have an understanding of what it took to actually, complete the task at hand. And it's only until Sherman and Grant, McPherson, some of these others who'd been out west, once they really ascend to leadership positions and it's their vision that's being listened to by Stanton, Lincoln, and others, that the war really begins to turn, in part because they had really just a much better fundamental understanding of what it would take to actually fight this war. And part of it is because they were in the West where so much of it was taking place. They had seen just the severity of it firsthand. But part of it, I think, is just their own kind of personal natures, right? That's kind of who they were.
I think that's fair.
Sure.
To the time.
For
That's
sure.
what we need.
For sure. And you're absolutely right. And he basically talks Grant out of resigning. And it could have been very easy for him to basically get into a contest with Grant about who would be most famous, who could outdo each other. But he's always very clear that he thinks that Grant is like the man of the hour. And he says that he's not going to do anything to try to jeopardize the kind of relationship they have.
I think he calmed Grant the night of Shaw, when they got their butt handed to him
Uh-huh.
the
Uh-huh.
day. And he walked up behind him and he said, devil had us today.
That's right, yeah.
Grant said, make it more.
That's right. Yeah. That's this famous line. Yeah. And at that point, Sherman's still kind of a nobody, So yeah, no, they definitely had a sort of symbiosis there together, them two. Yeah, sure.
I've always read that Sherman, and I wanted to get your confirmation of it, he had nothing against the common folk in the
Uh-huh.
South. Nothing. What he deeply despised were the plantation owners.
Uh-huh.
He actually abhorred the plantation owners. Would you agree with that?
Yes and no. He didn't in the sense that he lived amongst them for so long. When he was in Charleston, he went to plenty of balls. He dated lots of Southern belles, He didn't really have an issue with them when he was living there. His real issue is in the war when so many people are basically asking him for favors. And two, he cannot stand the kind of presumptuousness that many slaveholders had, plantation owners had, to ask him to return enslaved people or to ask him to, not be as harsh as he was being, because he thought this was asinine, right? Like, why, what kind of gumption do you have, right, to ask me these things? If you want me to do these things, you should surrender, right? And it's this sort of consistent sort of clawing at him to do these things on their behalf that basically leads him to say, like, you fundamentally don't understand, right, what's happening. and that's where some of his animosity, right, towards, the plantation class is born out of.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What will be the subject of your next book?
Well, it's Sherman himself, and the kind of angle that I'm taking is that I told my editor this, that I'd only do it if I did it this way, is that it's going to be about Sherman in the war, but it's also going to be about Sherman in the West. Because not only was he so involved with setting policy for Native Americans after the war, he's really important in the vision and the making of the Transcontinental Railroad, and he's really important in the California Gold Rush. He's actually in the room when gold is first discovered in California, or when it's brought to the representatives of the government. He's there. And though it's signed by his superior, he claims to have written the first report that basically alerted folks in Washington to the discovery of gold in California, which sent all of those 49ers west. And so it's going to try to think about Sherman, not just in the context of the Civil War, but really over, the span of the 19th century and some of these really important episodes in the making of the West, right? I know he's from Ohio. He himself was a Northerner, but he liked to define himself as a Southerner. And he also kind of saw himself as a Westerner. It's part of why he's buried in St. Louis, because he spent so much time sitting in St. Louis, looking west, thinking about what the plains might look like one day, what California might look like, what sort of railroads could be built here, so on and so forth. So.
Any other questions?
I'd like for you to touch on the very last part of your book, which describes the Grand Review and compared General Lee's army and how they marched in front of the president, Johnson at the time, and then
Yeah, sure. So the book ends with what's known as the Grand Review of the Armies, which is a 2-day affair in May 23rd and 24th, 1865. And what it is a final celebration to celebrate the Army after surrender. And it's a 2-day affair because the first day, the Army in the East, Meade's Army, they go first. Sherman watches them. But everyone in D.C., the whole place is booked out, right? There's no hotels available because so many people are there. There's grandstands set up and down Pennsylvania Avenue. They all want to see Sherman's army because that's the army of the West they haven't seen. They've heard so much about them, but they haven't been able to see them. And so Sherman's army steals the show. And people are amazed because they're rugged, their flags have holes in them, their clothes are faded. They march exceptionally well, as one would expect, right, given what they had just done. But they aren't sort of the rigid, sort of showy ceremonial movements of Meade's army. And then they're amazed because there are refugees that are following Sherman's army through the Grand Review. They're there. And none other than Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, right, the hero of Gettysburg. He's one of the heroes of Gettysburg. He's there, and he writes, and I'm paraphrasing, but he says that I'm aware that they bested us, that they being Sherman's army, that they were the ones people wanted to see. And he recognizes the fact that there were refugees following his army. He says something along the lines of, like, I've just seen, right, what this war was about. And that's where the book ends, because here's someone like Chamberlain kind of recognizing what made Sherman's army unique and important in the experience that he had just had. So that's where the book comes to an end.
Any other questions? Well, let's thank our.
All right. Yeah. Thank you.
We have, there's books for sale downstairs, and Dr. Parton will gladly sign them for you. And I want to make a little presentation of a souvenir of your Lancaster visit there. So thank you for coming. And yeah, I just want to remind everybody our next meeting in October is going to be, it's going to be the Sunday, the 19th. So you'll be hearing more about that. So you bet. Well, thanks everyone for coming. And if you want your book signed, just yes, downstairs. So thanks again, and have a safe trip home.